thought you were so lucky because you were a star, but you cry, cry, cry in the lonely dark. And I'm sorry for what you went through. I always thought the lucky one was you, but the lucky one was me. I wanted to be you so bad. Your life looked like so much fun. The fashion lights and fancy things made it seem like you had won. But little did I know, you were crying all the time. You were hurting inside when everyone thought you were fine. I thought you were so lucky because you were a star, but you cry, cry, cry in the lonely dark. And I'm sorry for what you went through. I always thought the lucky one was you, but the lucky one was me. I know you made some mistakes, but we're all only human. You were judged for everything. They put the blame on you when you were pushed over the edge. It ain't right what they allege. I thought you were so lucky, but the lucky one was me. I thought you were so lucky because you were a star, but you cry, cry, cry in the lonely dark. And I'm sorry for what you went through. I always thought the lucky one was you, but the lucky one was me.
Ladies and gentlemen, there are moments in life when we feel utterly alone, cast aside by the world, left to wander in the wilderness of our thoughts. It is during these times that we ask the hardest questions. Why is this happening to me? What have I done to deserve such isolation? These are the times when God seems silent, the world distant, and we ourselves adrift. Yet I am here to tell you that such isolation is not without reason. It is in fact a part of a divine plan. God isolates us for a reason, whether we find ourselves removed from familiar comforts, distanced from relationships we once depended on, or pushed into a solitude that feels unbearable. God is at work. His wisdom, far beyond our understanding, seeks to refine us, to prepare us, and to guide us toward a destiny we may not yet comprehend. It is in the quiet places, away from the noise of the world, that God can speak to us most clearly. It is in the stillness that we can hear his voice. Today I want to explore this idea, the truth that isolation is not abandonment but preparation. God pulls us away from what is familiar, not because he has forgotten us, but because he loves us enough to prepare us for something greater. We must trust that in his timing this isolation will bear fruit beyond what we could imagine. Let us journey together through this truth, with hearts open to the lessons God has for us in the wilderness. God's isolation is a tool for reflection. When God isolates us, he provides a sacred space for reflection. In our everyday lives, we are often overwhelmed by noise, distractions, and the incessant demands of the under us. These distractions, though commonplace, often pull us away from the deeper truths we need to explore. By removing us from the hustle and bustle, God opens up a space for us to truly reflect on who we are and where we are headed. In moments of isolation, we are forced to face ourselves without the usual distractions. This can be an uncomfortable process, but it is also an opportunity for growth. We begin to see aspects of ourselves that we might otherwise ignore. Our flaws, insecurities, and fears come into focus, not to condemn us, but to challenge us to change. God's isolation is not a punishment, but an invitation, a call to look inward and confront the things that have been hindering our spiritual journey. Moreover, in this solitude, we are given the opportunity to listen more intently to the voice of God. It is often said that God speaks in a still, small voice, one that can be easily drowned out by the clamor of life. In isolation, that voice becomes clearer, and we are more attuned to the guidance God has for us. We learn to recognize his presence in the quiet, and this recognition leads us to a deeper understanding of his will for our lives. Isolation also allows us to reevaluate our priorities. When we are stripped of the things we once relied on, we are compelled to ask ourselves what truly matters. What are the things that have eternal value? In this process of reflection, God refines our hearts, showing us what is essential and what we need to let go of. This clarity is a gift that can only come from time spent in isolation where distractions fade and truth comes into sharp relief. Ultimately, God's purpose in isolating us for reflection is to prepare us for the next chapter of our lives. We cannot move forward without first looking inward. Isolation is a season of preparation, a time to gather strength, wisdom, and clarity for what lies ahead. In this reflection, we find the tools we need to step into the future God has designed for us with renewed purpose and a clearer sense of direction. Isolation as a call to dependence on God. When God isolates us, He calls us to rely on Him in ways we may not have before. In our comfort zones, we often rely on our own strength, abilities, and resources. We trust in our routines, our relationships, and our own plans. But when God removes these from our lives, we are left with one option: to trust in Him completely. In this season of isolation, we begin to see how fragile our earthly dependencies truly are. The people we thought would always be there, the plans we meticulously crafted, and the resources we once relied on, all of these can be taken away in an instant. And when they are, we find ourselves in a place of vulnerability. It is in this vulnerability that God's power is made perfect. We are reminded of our dependence on Him, not as a last resort, but as our first and only true refuge. Dependence on God is not something we can fully grasp when we are surrounded by the noise of life. It is in the quiet moments, when we are stripped of our usual supports, that we learn to lean on Him in ways we never thought possible. We discover that God is not only our provider, but our sustainer. He is the one who holds us together when everything else falls apart. And moreover, this season of isolation teaches us to trust in God's timing. In our human nature, we often want immediate answers and solutions. We want to know why we are in this season and how long it will last. But God does not work on our timeline. He has His own perfect timing, and in the waiting we learn to trust Him more deeply. We learn to let go of our need for control and to surrender to His plan. Finally, dependence on God in isolation strengthens our faith. It is easy to have faith when everything is going well, but true faith is tested in the fire of hardship. When we have nothing else to rely on but God, our faith grows stronger. We learn to walk by faith and not by sight, trusting that God is with us even when we cannot see the way forward. This dependence on God is the foundation of a faith that can withstand any trial. Isolation is preparation for greater purpose. God's isolation is not without purpose. In fact, it is often a sign that He is preparing us for something greater. Throughout the Bible, we see examples of individuals who were isolated before stepping into their destiny. Moses spent years in the wilderness before leading the Israelites out of Egypt. Joseph was thrown into a pit and later imprisoned before becoming a ruler in Egypt. Even Jesus Himself spent 40 days in the wilderness before beginning His public ministry. In each of these cases, His isolation was not a time of abandonment, but a time of tiration. God was working behind the scenes, shaping these individuals for the roles they would eventually play in His divine plan. And the same is true for us. When God isolates us, He has not cast us aside. He is preparing us for something we cannot yet do. Isolation is a time of refining. Just as gold is refined in the fire, so too are we refined in the furnace of isolation. God uses this time to strip away the things that are not essential, to purify our heart, and to strengthen our character. It is in this season that we are prepared for the greater purpose God has for our lives. Moreover, isolation teaches us patience. We live in a world that values instant gratification, but God's ways are often slower and more deliberate. In isolation, we learn to wait on God's timing. We learn that the things worth having, the things that truly matter, time to develop. And in this waiting, we are being prepared for the greater work God has in store for us. Finally, isolation reminds us that our purpose is not our own. God has a plan for each of our lives, but that plan is always part of a larger story. In isolation, we are given the opportunity to step back and see the bigger picture. When we begin to understand that our lives are not just about our own comfort or success, but about playing a role in God's kingdom, this shift in perspective prepares us to step into our purpose with humility and a deeper sense of calling. The role of isolation in spiritual growth. Isolation plays a crucial role in our spiritual growth. In the busyness of life, it is easy to neglect our spiritual well-being. We get caught up in the demands of work, relationships, and daily responsibilities, and our spiritual lives take a backseat. But when God isolates us, he gives us the opportunity to refocus on our spiritual growth. In isolation, we are stripped of the distractions that often pull us away from God. We are given the time and space to deepen our relationship with him. This is a time to immerse ourselves in prayer, to study his word, and to listen for his voice. It is in these moments of solitude that our spiritual roots grow deeper, grounding us in our faith. Moreover, isolation reveals our spiritual weaknesses. When we are surrounded by the comforts of life, we may not realize how spiritually dependent we are on external things. But when those things are taken away, we are confronted with the reality of our spiritual state. This can be a humbling experience, but it is also an opportunity for growth. In isolation, we are forced to confront our spiritual shortcomings and seek God's strength to overcome them. Isolation also fosters a greater sense of dependence on God's grace. When we are isolated, we are often brought face to face with our own inadequacies. We realize that we cannot rely on our own strength or wisdom. It is in this place of weakness that God's grace becomes more apparent. We learn to rely on his grace not just for our salvation, but for daily sustenance and strength. Finally, isolation leads to spiritual maturity. As we go through the process of isolation, we are stretched and challenged, and never would have been otherwise. And otherwise, we learn to persevere through trials, to trust God in the unknown, and to seek him above all else. This process of growth leads to a deeper, more mature faith that can withstand the challenges of life. Isolation is a time of renewal. One of the greatest gifts of isolation is the opportunity for renewal. In the constant rush of life, we often find ourselves running on empty. We pour out our energy, time, and resources, leaving little left for ourselves. But when God isolates us, he invites us to rest and be renewed. In isolation, we are given the chance to step away from the demands of life and focus on our own well-being. This is not a selfish act, but a necessary one. Just as Jesus often withdrew to quiet places to pray and rest, so too must we take time to renew our strength. In this time of renewal, we are filled with the energy and clarity we need to continue on the journey God has set before us. Moreover, isolation provides an opportunity for emotional and mental renewal. Life's challenges can take a toll on our emotional and mental health. The pressures of work, relationships, and daily responsibilities can leave us feeling drained and overwhelmed. In isolation, we are given the space to process these emotions and find healing. God's isolation is not just about spiritual renewal, but about holistic renewal, renewing our mind, body, and spirit. Isolation also allows for the renewal of our perspective. When we are in the thick of life's challenges, it can be difficult to see things clearly. But in isolation, we are given the opportunity to step back and gain a new perspective. We begin to see things from a broader view, understanding that God's plan is bigger than our current circumstances. This renewed perspective gives us the strength to keep going, even when the road ahead seems uncertain. Finally, isolation prepares us for the renewal of our purpose. When we are isolated, we are not just being renewed for our own sake. God is preparing us for a new season of purpose and calling. This time of renewal equips us with the strength, wisdom, and clarity we need to step into the next chapter of our lives with confidence and purpose. Isolation is a catalyst for transformation. Isolation is not just a time of waiting, it is a time of transformation. When God isolates us, he is not merely removing us from the world, he is transforming us from the inside out. This transformation is often uncomfortable as it requires us to let go of old patterns, habits, and mindsets. But it is a necessary process if we are to step into the fullness of what God has for us. In isolation, we are given the opportunity to confront the parts of ourselves that need to change. Though this can be a painful process, as it often involves facing our own weaknesses, fears, and insecurities.
Morning kiss, soft and sweet, a new day's bliss. Midnight bliss, underneath the moon's soft kiss. Hold me tight, in the dark you're my guiding light. Can't resist, in your arms everything feels right. In every touch my heart ignites it new. My love, there's no more fight. You hands, time moves slow. Touch my soul. Your love's the fire that makes me whole, and it shows. Together let our true selves unfold. I'm hallowed, every whisper of a story told. In your eyes, my heart's been sold. You are a star, in the world you're the brightest part, shining bright, illuminating every darkened night. In my heart, with you lost a work of art. All the night, in your embrace, I take flight. Oh baby, with you every day feels right. In your love I find my light. Stay with me, let's dance under the moonlit sea. Just be free. In your arms I find my plea. In your light I find strength, I find my might. I believe in this love we're meant to be. Ooh, in your light my dreams take flight. With you everything feels right. You are a star, in the world you're the brightest part, shining bright, illuminating every darkened night. In my heart, with you lost a work of art. All the night, in your embrace, I take flight. Heart, heart, no, together we shine so bright. In your love, my heart's alight.
Confrontation that true transformation occurs. God uses isolation to strip away the things that are holding us back, allowing us to become more like Him. Moreover, isolation is a time of transformation in our relationships. When we are isolated, we often find that certain relationships fall away. This can be difficult as we may feel abandoned or rejected. But God is at work in these moments, removing relationships that are not aligned with His purpose for our lives. He is making space for new relationships that will support and encourage us on our journey. Isolation also transforms our priorities. In the busyness of life, we often lose sight of what truly matters. But in isolation, we are given the opportunity to reevaluate our priorities and align them with God's will. This transformation of priorities allows us to live with greater intentionality and purpose, focusing on the things that have eternal value. Finally, isolation leads to a transformation of our faith. When we are isolated, we are often brought to the end of ourselves. We realize that we cannot rely on our own strength or wisdom. It is in this place of surrender that God's transformative power is at work. Our faith is deepened, our trust in God grows stronger, and we are transformed into the people He has called us to be. The role of isolation in building resilience. Isolation builds resilience. In life, we will face challenges, setbacks, and disappointments. But it is in these moments of isolation that we develop the resilience needed to persevere. God uses isolation to strengthen our character, teaching us how to endure through trials and tribulations. When we are isolated, we are often forced to rely on our own inner strength. This can be a daunting task, as we may feel weak and incapable. But it is in these moments that God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. We learn to draw on His power, and in doing so we develop a resilience that can withstand any challenge. Moreover, isolation teaches us the value of perseverance. In a world that often values instant gratification, isolation reminds us that the things worth having take time and effort and effort. We learn to persevere through the waiting, trusting that God's timing is perfect. This perseverance builds resilience, allowing us to face future challenges with greater strength and determination. Isolation also builds resilience in our faith. When we are isolated, we are often brought to a place of doubt and uncertainty. We may question God's plan, wondering why we are in this season of isolation. But as we continue to trust Him, even when we cannot see the way forward, our faith is strengthened. This resilient faith allows us to face future challenges with confidence, knowing that God is with us. Finally, isolation builds resilience in our relationships. When we are isolated, we may experience the loss of certain relationships. This can be painful, but it also teaches us the value of resilience in our relationships. We learn to let go of toxic or unhealthy relationships and to invest in those that are life-giving and supportive. This resilience allows us to build stronger, healthier relationships in the future. Isolation is an invitation to deeper intimacy with God. One of the greatest gifts of isolation is the opportunity to deepen our intimacy with God. In the busyness of life, it is easy to neglect our relationship with Him. We get caught up in the demands of work, family, and daily responsibility, leaving little time for prayer, worship, or simply being in His presence. But when God isolates us, He invites us into a deeper relationship with Him. In isolation, we are given the time and space to seek God more intentionally. We are no longer distracted by the noise of the world, and we can focus on deepening our connection with Him. This is a time to immerse ourselves in His Word, to spend time in prayer, and to listen for His voice. It is in these moments of solitude that we experience the sweetness of His presence in ways we never had before. Moreover, isolation allows us to experience God's love in a more profound way. When we are isolated, we often feel abandoned or forgotten. But it is in these moments that God's love becomes more apparent. We begin to understand that His love is not based on our circumstances or our performance. It is a love that is constant, unchanging, and unconditional. This deeper understanding of God's love leads to a greater intimacy with Him. Isolation also allows us to experience God's peace. In the chaos of life, it is easy to become anxious or overwhelmed, but in isolation we are given the opportunity to rest in God's peace. This peace is not dependent on our circumstances, but on our relationship with Him. As we draw closer to God in isolation, we experience a peace that surpasses all understanding. Finally, isolation leads to a deeper intimacy with God through trust. When we are isolated, we are often faced with uncertainty and doubt. We may not understand why we are in this season or how long it will last. But as we continue to trust God, even in the midst of uncertainty, our intimacy with Him grows. We learn to rely on Him in ways we never have before, and this trust deepens our relationship with Him. Isolation is a time to refocus on God's purpose. Isolation provides an opportunity to refocus on God's purpose for our lives. In the busyness of life, it is easy to lose sight of our true calling. We get caught up in the demands of work, relationships, and daily responsibilities, and we forget the larger purpose that God has for us. But in isolation, we are given the time and space to refocus on what truly matters. In this season of isolation, we are able to step back and reevaluate our lives. We begin to ask ourselves important questions. What is God's purpose for my life? Am I living in alignment with His will? These questions help us refocus our attention on what is truly important and guide us back to the path that's set before us. Moreover, isolation allows us to gain clarity on God's purpose. When we are surrounded by distractions, it can be difficult to hear God's voice. But in isolation, we are given the opportunity to listen more intently to His guidance. This clarity helps us understand the specific purpose God has for our lives and gives us the direction we need to move forward. Isolation also provides an opportunity to realign our priorities with God's purpose. In the busyness of life, it is easy to become focused on the wrong things. We may prioritize our own comfort, success, or desires rather than God's will. But in isolation, we are given the opportunity to let go of these distractions and realign our priorities with God's purpose. This realignment helps us live with greater intentionality and focus. Finally, isolation prepares us to step into God's purpose. When we are isolated, we are being prepared for the next chapter of our lives. God is equipping us with the strength, wisdom, and clarity we need to fulfill Elijah. As we emerge from isolation, we are ready to step into our calling with renewed confidence and a deeper sense of purpose. The role of isolation in strengthening our faith. The isolation strengthens our faith in ways that few other experiences can. When we are isolated, we are often brought to a place of dependence on God. We realize that we cannot rely on our own strength, wisdom, or resources. It is in this place of surrender that our faith is tested and strengthened. In isolation, we are given the opportunity to trust God in new and deeper ways. We may not understand why we are in this season or what the outcome will be, but we learn to trust that God is in control. This trust builds a stronger, more resilient faith that can withstand the challenges of life. Moreover, isolation forces us to confront our doubts and fears. When we are surrounded by distractions, it is easy to avoid these difficult emotions, but in isolation we are given the space to face them head on. As we wrestle with our doubts and fears, we learn to lean on God in ways we never had before. This process strengthens our faith as we come to understand that God is bigger than our doubts and fears. Isolation also deepens our dependence on God's provision. When we are isolated, we often find that we lack the resources we need, whether that be emotional, physical, spiritual resources. But it is in these moments that we learn to rely on God's provision. We come to understand that He is our provider and that He will supply all our needs according to His riches in glory. Finally, isolation strengthens our faith by teaching us to wait on God's timing. In a world that values instant gratification, waiting can be one of the most challenging aspects of life. But in isolation, we learn the importance of waiting on God's perfect timing. This waiting strengthens our faith as we come to trust that God's timing is always better than our own. As we conclude, let us remember that isolation is not a punishment, but a gift. It is in the stillness and solitude that we find renewal, transformation, resilience, and a deeper intimacy with God. Isolation is a sacred space where we are invited to refocus on God's purpose, strengthen our faith. It is a season of preparation, equipping us to step into the next chapter of our lives with confidence and purpose. So do not fear isolation. Embrace it as part of God's greater plan for your life, and for your life, and for your life.